You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Keane. I'm the editor-in-chief of the internationally renowned journal Fire Ecology, published by Springer Nature. I want to thank you all today. We have a very exciting paper and a very exciting person to give us a summary of that paper. Today, we're going to talk about biotic and physical drivers of fire in northwestern Patagonia by Iván Barberá. Iván, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little about yourself?
Hello, Bo. Thanks for having me. I am a biologist, PhD student in Bariloche, Argentina, and I am finishing my PhD. I recently submitted my PhD thesis. I studied fire drivers in northwestern Patagonia, aiming to make models to predict fire activity under future climate. And as part of that project, we did this study.
Well, it's a wonderful paper. It's very good. One of these papers I think Fire Ecology needs to publish for every part of the world because it's very comprehensive, describing fire in Patagonia. Can you tell us a little more about this paper, Iván?
Well, this paper is a description of fire patterns and drivers in the last 24 years here in northwestern Patagonia. But the special feature about our article is that we tried to separate the effect of biotic and physical drivers of fire, and that are usually correlated and hard to disentangle their effects. So using observational data, we try to separate those effects and with a very careful treatment of correlated variables and such things.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the approach you made. Why did you do this study in the first place?
The short answer is because we don't have the detailed field models as in North America, for example. So to predict fire activity under future climate, we use very simple empirical models of fire, where one of the predictors is the vegetation type. But we usually parameterize those models based on the past occurrence of fire. But to do so, you have to really understand why some vegetation types burn more than others. Because perhaps the vegetation type that burns the most is not the intrinsically more flammable. Perhaps it just lives in a place where it's warmer, so it burns more because of that. Or it burns more because humans live near there, so there are more ignitions. When you base your models on observational data, you have to be very careful about how you estimate the effect of some variables. If we had the detailed description of fuel properties and good weather variables and climatic variables at high resolution, we would not need to do this. But anyway, it is interesting to understand how vegetation type affects fire and how vegetation types is affected by other variables that also affect fire. That is why we did this. Started as an exploratory analysis where we would say, well, what predictors should we include in our empirical models, in our fire simulation models? Then I noticed that I had to do a harder work to disentangle the effects of physical variables or human influence and vegetation type. So it ended in this study a bit more detailed in this paper.
Well, the Journal of Fire Ecology really emphasizes Spanish-speaking or Spanish-reading people, and I wonder if you can tell us just very quickly about the paper in Spanish.
Bueno, nuestro artículo trata de patrones espaciales y temporales de incidencia del fuego en el noroeste de la Patagonia, en Argentina. Y lo que es particularmente interesante de este artículo es que intentamos separar los efectos de la vegetación y de variables más bien físicas o de influencia humana que afectan el fuego, que generalmente también afectan el tipo de vegetación donde ocurren. Y bueno, hicimos un esfuerzo considerable en analizar con cuidado los efectos de estas variables para poder estimar bien los efectos de cada una y no confundirnos. Por ejemplo, si el tipo de vegetación se quema más por vivir en un lugar que es muy propicio para el fuego, porque, por ejemplo, hace mucho calor, un lugar de baja elevación, o si es porque ese tipo de vegetación tiene particularmente características que la hacen más propensa al fuego, como alta densidad de combustible y características similares.
Thanks for that. I appreciate it. So, what was special about the methods that you use in this study?
Well, I think that in most articles about fire drivers, the vegetation type or fuel type, I say vegetation type because I like more to see it as vegetation and not only fuel. You are very mean when you say fuel. It's not just fuel, they are living plants, please. So most studies about fire drivers treat the vegetation type as another predictor. And perhaps when you include the effects of very many predictors of fire activity, you can have the estimate of the effects of vegetation type and compare them by fixing the other predictors at their mean, for for example. But when you do that, you assume that all vegetation types live in the same environment, and that is not accurate, and that leads to comparisons that are not realistic. So first, we analyzed in very much detail how fire drivers like topography, climate, or distance to human settlements affect vegetation type, so we could know where each vegetation type lives. And then we compared the burn probability of different vegetation types, fixing the environmental predictors, but not fixing them in a single value common for all vegetation types. We partitioned the environmental space to characterize conditions where a few vegetation types might live together, and we only compared the vegetation types that might be together in certain conditions. So we had a very careful treatment of predictors, the correlation between predictors, to quantify the effects of different variables. And all these analyses can also be considered from the perspective of the physical drivers. You may have a physical driver like elevation, which affects fire, but elevation itself affects also vegetation type. The vegetation type might be hiding the effect of elevation. For example, if elevation has a very physical effect on fire through temperature, it is generally observed that at higher elevation you have lower fire incidence. But if a certain plant community, lives in high elevation, has specific properties such as low foliar moisture content, you might see that in that area, fire incidence is higher at high elevation because a certain plant community lives there with a certain property. So you have to take into account the characteristics of vegetation types along the elevation gradient. So we analyzed the effect of physical drivers, both ignoring the vegetation type and considering it, to notice whether the effect of physical drivers remained if the vegetation type was considered or not. So we could identify more direct effects of these physical drivers on fire.
It's really interesting. Your results are incredibly interesting. So how do you think the results can be used by people such as managers or other scientists?
By scientists in a wider context, perhaps some could do this when they are doing observational studies and they cannot describe the field properties like in field models. You could analyze the data with a similar approach to have these caveats into account. And by us, who can be more certain about which variables to include in the fire simulation models and how to do it. And for managers, this study helped to identify which vegetation types are the most flammable and which are the field properties related to those vegetation types, to try to imitate, for example, the structure of the least flammable communities to reduce fire risk.
Very interesting. I want to thank you for coming on here and talking about this incredibly interesting study. I see your list of co-authors as a who's who of fire. Could you recognize your co-authors and perhaps some funding agencies?
My co-authors were Ana Singolani, who helped me a lot to formalize these ideas, and Florencia Tiribelli, Mónica Marmós, Juan Manuel Morales, and Thomas Kitzberger. The funding agency was the Ministerio de Ciencia e Innovación Productiva in Argentina, and the CONICET, el Consejo Nacional de Investigaciones Científicas y Tecnológicas, provided me a scholarship for my PhD. So thanks, all of them. And thank you, Bob, for having me. A nice opportunity to be here.
Thank you. Appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone, for coming and listening to this wonderful podcast. If you're interested about this paper, guess what? You can download it for free at the website. We have already paid for all the paper's cost, so all you have to do is download it and you get it for free from the journal's website. Thanks for joining us today, and thank you, Iván. We'll see you on the next Fire Ecology Chat.
Thank you for listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our show and leave us a review. To learn more about fire ecology and support our future work by becoming a member, visit fireecology.org. FIREECOLOGY.org.